Good morning. How are you today?
Do you know if the fishery thing is happening in that room?
It is. It's happening in the center. Yep.
And I can just plug in back there somewhere?
Unfortunately, right now, we've got all of our outs rerouted out to the side rooms for all of the, we've got virtual sessions happening here. So all of the audio packages right now are all, they're all speaking. Let's see what I can do.
Yeah. So what are you guys doing?
I'm doing well. We already saw
See
it.
ya.
Well, it's nice to see some interesting people like you on our panel. So.
Yes, I said. I was a patient. You ever go somewhere?
So, where we have some of the right?
I knew what to say.
Stand sort of up at the front and then the session chair goes over there. Yeah, let's just do that, and then I'll put these here, and the session chair can give them out. And then for the other rooms, we have.
Confirm, yeah.
We're in the middle room, yeah, sorry about that. We had to mix it up because it's audio visual. Yes. So, so if you want, you can do it yourself if you want. It's just on the screen right there, and then you can type like that. And I've got a folder on the desktop. And you want it.
And look at opportunities to add, pull some up.
Okay.
I think it's the same thing as in Calgary. Mainly,
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's set something up. I'll give you an hour. You guys will be motion regulation. Yeah, so start from the middle of working. That's immediately got to go 5 minutes. Yeah. I think so.
what's
Yeah, let's keep watching.
She said that they are working back and forth in America. So, maybe something.
Yeah, I know, some of the things like. Or undo work that others.
Yes. Or you're one of the 10 different silos.
Yes.
Where you should sit down
Yes.
and say, everybody tell you, here's what you need. So say,
So the problem with this sort of thing, it's federal, because they all have to be the same thing.
they all had.
By the time speaking is powerful, and get the funds, be in a position to be able to leverage those funds. You yourself have to pay.
Well, some do. I'm working with it. But it's, you gotta, after you have the infrastructure, okay, we're gonna get the information in the people. That's what's supposed to happen.
Yes.
It's a real burden for people. So many communities would consider, but just they can't maintain them.
And then the communities that these sophisticated water systems, and 9-10 funding, they don't have one single person to look at them. So it's a local business project.
Oh, yeah.
So what I'm just said context not changing. I'm just going to talk about municipality and particular small municipalities.
How you got involved, actually came out from our body, and you turned up to the way forward.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm talking to I was mentioning the property you came out, you toured around the town, you went through the places, how things are actually hospitals now, with treatment, a lot of issues, so in a way, research, sort of thing.
Well, and you know, I bet this kind of company. So that's one of the, I think we'll be good.
Because I have a, when I start to Chris, put it down. Let's go down. Everybody coffee? What is it, right, coffee? Yeah, people are out there with changes.
So this being a change. Very difficult to share.
I'm actually using that. That's really
Well, but anyway.
Yes.
Yes, and by the way, right.
Ever, wasn't sure, I saw him walking, but we had a chat.
Yes, I will be here. Just, start here.
That's okay. Cheers.
Yeah, there you go. You can say what else you
No, it's just that I was there and then I'm like, I'm just gonna move here, because my friend is there.
Okay.
At the same time, I'm like, oh,
Maybe just go to a big space.
yes.
And that starts to draw. And now we do like travel.
You too. Like you from art.
I do. I have a Asian that I work at.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, okay, nice.
How about yourself?
I'm grad student at the Environmental Policy Association. And my supervisor is actually up here.
Kelly Ball.
No, actually,
Okay.
but my supervisor is up.
Oh, I know that. I know. I did not.
She teaches a lot of
But we're really focused on.
undergrad, actually, I think she teaches undergrad classes.
So we got throughout training.
But she's a great supervisor. Kelly's amazing.
And you're.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. She's very good. I mean, she was based here for a few years.
And as they change the
I had very second country.
Either way.
I had a meeting with her because I'm working on a project we got with her. And she's like, oh, I'm actually, it's just like, she didn't take a vacation. She said she was gonna be gone. So I never know when she's going to go. No, but I found out that she is on vacation.
Oh.
She's probably going to Spain and I'm gonna be here.
Oh. Is that where you're from?
No, I'm
Mexico. Oh.
Mexico City.
Okay, very good. Well, the good news is we moved
A little bit of.
and it's like research session. We're going to of course, that's to make sure that we have your audio, and if we don't, I can.
But I mean, it's pretty dominant.
Yes.
You will find some indigenous, like just, actually a ton of them,
Yeah.
but they usually kind of like me.
Yeah. That sounds good. Right now,
And then a lot of
everyone else
them
is
were
doing
very
good.
much in the languages to the point
And you get, you get some fast.
and that's, I didn't appreciate that.
Hi, Amy.
One of my aunts, she's
George is back into
and she was speaking other languages. I
To teach you the best.
no, just, yeah, because
Or to speak.
just like
One sec, I can hear you on the phone, but I can't hear you in the room. Cool.
I went to meet under our.
Yeah. How do we make it
But no,
clear
wait,
her? Do you know how to do this?
I think that's gold.
I can run and get John done.
I think you should do that.
1 second.
By the time I spent in Mexico City was pretty short. Not much more than a week. That wasn't really field work. I was moving from field work and I spent time Charlotte and St. Which was amazing.
Yeah, that's.
So such a great.
I feel like you're somewhere else.
Exactly. I couldn't believe I was basically in the city.
Yeah, and just a little bit of what the lake used to be.
Right.
And I know that we have this, those little animals, amphibians,
Yes.
are going extinct. But I didn't realize that that's it. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Yes, so.
It was tiny. It was magical.
Yeah.
So we have,
We have them here. Oh, I think our volume is just quite down here, actually. Here we go.
can you hear us? I need the microphone on.
So you can hear it. Yeah, and if you turn that microphone on, you'll hear us.
Can you hear me? They can hear me.
You can hear. I've got it.
Try us again, Miss Hudson. Oh, I can hear her a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There
we
we
can
go.
hear you. Can it go a little louder than that, John?
Yes.
We can still see you and we can hear you. Hi, Ashley. Is that Ashley? Oh, yeah. There you go. Awesome. Ashley, your volume is very good. What are you doing that's different than Amy? You're closer to the mic. Yeah, that was a good reenactment of a lean. Jessica, can we hear you? Yeah, we can hear you good. You can hear us okay? Cool. So we should be good to go? Oh. Awesome. Whoa.
Oh, yeah, I
Oh,
think
Amy
that's
is
sharing.
screen sharing with us. Okay, awesome. Jessica, Amy, Ashley, we're running about 10 minutes behind, so we're going to get started a little late, but the session's going to run for the full amount of time still. So people should start fluttering in here in the next few minutes or so. Work? All right, we'll see you shortly.
Nick, excellent. I'll show you this. So I'm going to be floating back and forth anyway, but in case something comes up. So when someone's, I think we've got a couple of local presentations happening from this side. To share it back to them, just hit your screen share up here, click the sharing this screen, and you're good to go.
So they can see what we're doing.
They will see what you have on this
And then
screen.
how do I cancel that at the end? Let's go back
It
again.
should be right up at the top. There's a little hovering bar, and there's a big red end sharing, and
Okay.
it'll go back to
Perfect.
what you see here.
So maybe I should just share our screen with them now.
Oh,
so we
sure.
don't have to watch. So that's this one here.
Yep.
Share our screen. This one here.
Yep.
And
I saw.
Alipu is our first presenter.
Oh, I think that's a remote presenter. Just a second.
Perfect.
I'm not sure if you guys.
Yes. Ontario is shut down, but.
Because they were right. Why would I go away the whole day?
Right, yeah.
And even the case.
Yeah.
It's not just calling and screeners.
Sure. Yeah, well, there's quite a lot of work going on that. I'm doing a bit of work with organizations. For US based, but they also are active in Europe. Of course, what happens here. But it has yet to pass.
It just makes so much sense.
Yes, in many ways, that is, I guess, I mean, that's sort of on a personal level, very for my research, orientation, whatever makes me, I do work. You can get the right to it, but if their ability is to sell it out, it will better.
I didn't think about that, but yeah, they can just make something that's, what would they make, like something that's completely used?
If you, instead of things like, shade, always using pieces, and, depending on a variety of factors, materials, the way they're put together, and a device being maybe again materials that it may actually upper term materials.
Do you also extend the software because the more the access side is,
Yeah.
the memory becomes like you
Yeah.
run it.
I don't really know. I mean, I stay aware of how software obsolescence is device obsolescence. That's a huge issue, and it's one again right to where it actually doesn't get the right to device.
No, and that's one thing about the Apple, at least, like if you have an Android, I'm not sure how they're now, but you used to have the option to just like put a much bigger chip, like
Right.
SD card.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this one's there.
No, that's right. So things like again, design, modular, parts of
Yeah.
in some sense, what it gets at, like,
Oh god, now I'm a little crushed.
I'm not saying it's bad. It's just
No. Yeah, definitely is. My phone broke such a problem, and they told me it was a reverse, so I was going to implement them. They were like, oh, it's actually the inside is completely new, but we recycle it, and the outside like requires 100%. The case didn't recycle, and I think that was really good. Very important that at least they did that. Is that where they all end up?
the recycling. I mean, for sure, that's part of the material. It's a big part of how that gets handled. But there's also a pretty big movement for these devices, right? In the US, Europe, but also overseas, but not as much.
Yes.
Big, especially for devices. The highest quality. So that like you can go to other countries. Devices, but people, not all,
I have no idea. How about first?
maybe four China or in
No.
well, some of them, I mean, some of the products that we sold in China are large relative terms. You can go wide. But that's definitely not.
So isn't it the most expensive cities to live in the world in Shanghai?
Right. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. But I don't think it's that's fine.
Yeah. Even the next one, I just can't get it. I just got it expensive. And I guess the first album because of her was what he's my 4 or 5 years old.
You bought it.
No, I got it in the US.
It's where it was. Yeah.
I think I can make transportation.
Yes.
And it's very good for bicycles.
Yeah.
So for a long time, and even when it's not like service, I have to pay
Harder here.
Corn burgers is a killer.
Oh, right. Yes. The first.
And then sometimes I've tried to like switch gears when I'm going up.
Yeah.
Maybe just doing the lowest speed possible. Last time I did that, the gears jumped there, and I would just slip up. I got a bruise.
Oh,
I guess. It's not that bad. Sometimes I'm afraid. Then it's just.
Test 1, 2. Perfect.
I'm gonna grab coffee and water.
It's someone else. And that's what it should be. You make us friend. And have a big wall. She's probably gonna have a house at one party. No, stop. Yeah, like baby together.
Yeah.
I liked it. All these screens, they were like, and then that's the so that wasn't actually my question, but it was that interview. So then recently realized that honestly, this is a study of but I can't remember.
Right, but I do love
Alrighty, folks. Well, with that, I guess we're almost ready to get underway here in the Indigenous-led research session at Decarbonize Newfoundland and Labrador. You folks all know me now. My name is Nick Mercer. And through my community-based participatory research with and for the Nunatuavut Community Council, over the last 5 years, I've had the incredible privilege and honor to meet and work alongside of all the great people who are speaking on this panel today. So Amy Hudson at the Nunatuavut Community Council has been a huge mentor of mine. Ian Sullivan at Halapu First Nation is a friend of mine. Dr. Max Libran always keeps me in line. And Jessica Penny is a good friend as well. So I'm happy I've been able to play a small role in bringing everyone together here today. The purpose of this session is a little bit different than the rest of the sessions at Decarbonize Newfoundland and Labrador. Instead of creating a space where we bring in experts and then we try to develop a plan to decarbonize an economic sector, we really don't think that's our role in this sector. We really don't think we have a place to play here. Instead, what we want to do is we want to profile and we want to celebrate the incredible Indigenous-led climate change research, monitoring, policy, adaptation that's already happening here in Newfoundland and Labrador. In addition, we seek to demonstrate some really good research that's happening with researchers in the province with and for Indigenous communities in the province. So each speaker is going to have about 15 minutes to present. That'll be followed by about 5 minutes of individual Q&A to our speakers. I'll get up and mosey a little bit when you're almost out of time. And then following that, we're going to open it up to a broader panel to finish off the session. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce you folks to Ian Sullivan, who's the GIS technician with Halapu First Nation. Please welcome Ian, everyone.
Thank you for the introduction there, Nick. A little bit about myself before I get started. I have a background in forestry and GIS. Worked as a FRI, Forest Resource Inventory Specialist for 2 or 3 years before I started working at Halapu. And once I started working there, I had no real experience working with climate change research, but somebody had to do it, and I wound up taking on that project. Similar to Nick, I'm also rarely in public without a ball cap, and I actually brought mine with me, but as soon as I seen that nobody else was wearing a hat, I promptly took that off. So pardon the hat hair. Yeah, so I guess we'll jump right into it. Primarily going to be talking about what we've done, what we're doing, and what we plan to do in the future. And I won't be talking too much about the results that we've got out of what we've done, because I could talk for days on what came out of it. It was a pretty broad study, but you'll see when I get into it. So a little bit about Halapu First Nation. We have 67 communities within our territory that span 9 electoral wards and 21,000 members. Now, 21,000 members, that's a number that's been changing quite a bit over the last couple of years. I'm sure some people have heard about all the controversy that was going on with our membership. And the electoral wards, I normally include a map, but it tends to cause a little bit more confusion than anything else. So instead of giving you a bunch of questions, I just decided to omit it. So in 2017, we started our first climate change risk assessments, which I'll talk about after this slide. Starting this year, we began doing some climate monitoring. So we set up some climate monitoring stations, both terrestrial and aquatic, across all of our territory. And hopefully next year, we're going to be starting some more climate change impact assessments. So the ultimate goal is to get all of our communities covered with an impact assessment. It's kind of like our brace for impact situation in case we don't get the net zero carbon deal going. So the risk assessment. Most of our towns are low in elevation. I can't see what that other point is. Sorry. Oh, it says close to the coastline. A lot of our towns are built on floodplains. They only have 1 or 2 routes in and out of the town, so there's a risk of isolation, and that puts all of our communities at a risk of severe weather events. So the criteria that we looked at for the risk assessment included coastal flooding, proximity of roads to coastline, water quality reports. We looked at community connectivity and self-sufficiency, inland flooding, and we also did an Aboriginal traditional knowledge study. So the traditional knowledge study is just we have people go out into our communities and talk to our membership. We basically have a questionnaire that they run through, and we really try to get a geographical aspect to it because it's really hard to incorporate just anecdote into scientific research. Unfortunately, a lot of people spend most of their time talking about the weather, and it's kind of hard to get a geographical aspect to that just from people talking, I suppose. But so we looked at 9 different communities. We picked one from each ward. Gander Bay wound up being a little bit of a special case that I guess the right word there's I was kind of ignorant about Gander Bay. I didn't really know what Gander Bay entailed. I'd never been there. And most of our communities came as suggestions by ward councillors, or we used a random number generator. So it's essentially the digital equivalent of hauling names out of a hat. Gander Bay, on the other hand, was just a local service district, but it has its own ward. And when I looked a little closer at Gander Bay, I realized that it's comprised of many smaller communities, and there's no real hard line in between those communities. So if we were using municipal boundaries to essentially restrict our area of interest, and we had to use the ward boundary for Gander Bay. But that being said, there's only about 2,000 people in Gander Bay, so it was fitting for the rest of the scope of the project. So for data, we made sure to use free, public, and publicly available data. Going forward, I think we're going to try to invest a little bit in some higher quality data. The accuracy of publicly available data is just not that great, especially our digital elevation models for the island. Speaking of which, we had DEMs for pretty much every area that we had worked on. Our vector data came from CanVec, which is basically just Canadian vector data. We used a lot of satellite imagery as well to update the CanVec, and updating CanVec took quite a bit of elbow grease. So our first factor was coastal flooding. Did a lot of research on this, but because the DEM models that we used were quite coarse, we rounded everything just to 1 meter sea level rise by 2100. And we used 3 meter storm surge for 2100 as well. So this was just using digital elevation models. We found the base sea level, and we essentially did some raster math to just raise the water level up 4 meters, and any infrastructure that fell within that that new range for the base sea level, we deemed to be at risk. So it's a pretty simple feature in ArcGIS, if I guess you're familiar with ArcGIS at all. Community connectivity was the next one. It was pretty simple, and because this was such a broad study, a lot of these things were very surface level. This being one of them, it was literally just the number of routes in and out of a town. Pretty well any one of these criteria could easily be their own study for an individual town or QFN as a whole, really. But Burgeo was the big one that was our main takeaway from this. There's almost 200 kilometers of highway once you're off the Trans-Canada Highway. It's the only way in and out of the town unless you got a boat. So yeah, I mean the risk associated with inland flooding particularly kind of speaks for itself there. Self-sufficiency was the next one. So we looked at essential and non-essential services, sorry. And some of the essential ones are up on the screen there. That's not a comprehensive list. And there's some of the non-essential. And we weighed the essential services we weighed them higher than the non-essential services. And in combination with connectivity, you get a better idea of how resilient a town is to becoming isolated. The next one was water quality. So we looked at drinking water quality index. That was our primary one. It kind of incorporates the other aspects of water quality just from government reports. We also looked at THM and HAA, which are byproducts of sanitization. And we looked at supply type and source. So like artesian wells, whether or not it was groundwater or, yeah. So the next one was proximity to roads to coastline. It wasn't until we really got into this one that we realized it wasn't a good indicator of much of anything. So we looked at roads that were close to the coast being at risk of erosion and washout. Towns with large amounts of coastal roadways were more at risk of isolating citizens. And so we basically buffered coastlines and intersected roads. And that was a pretty simple process to do in GIS. But something we didn't consider until we got down into the heart of the study was that verticality is very important, and so is the substrate that the road is built on. Port to port being the biggest one that comes to mind. A lot of the roads are like 10, 20 feet away from the actual coastline, but they're on like 40, 50 feet of granite. So yeah, just horizontal distance to the coastline doesn't really work so well. Inland flooding, this one was quite challenging for somebody who has a background in forestry. Didn't really do much hydrological anything, to be honest. So poured my heart and soul into this one and found a nice little suite of tools for ARC 10.3 called ARC Hydro that pretty much took care of everything that we needed. The Newfoundland government also did some studies on areas like Badger and some other spots in central and western Newfoundland. So when we were having trouble getting some serious results out of ARC Hydro, the Newfoundland government conveniently has exactly what we were trying to do in publicly available data, available in shape files and AutoCAD files. So when we couldn't conjure it up ourselves, we just relied on what was already completed. Unfortunately, it was kind of irrelevant to many of the coastal communities. There's little streams and stuff going in through some coastal communities, but unless it's like Cox's Cove or something where there's a major waterway going through the town, there wasn't a lot of results came out of it, with the exception of central Newfoundland. So each town was given a score from each criteria. This was basically to give us like just a breakdown, a bite-sized piece of information that we could take away from the whole broad end of the study and just boil it down into one neat little number. So when it comes time to actually start planning and doing different types of assessments and action plans and stuff, we can look at which numbers or which towns scored the best and which towns scored poorly, and then we can prioritize where we go from there. So that was the risk assessment. At the moment, we have Delagiskig is how is the weather? You can't see the how there because it's behind the video. But in a nutshell, it's a climate monitoring project. We are doing this in conjunction with Canadian Forest Service. They're kind of giving us a little hand in terms of boots on the ground and getting our climate stations out there. And I think they're going to help us do some of the analysis too, because we're probably going to have an insane amount of data to parse once we're done. At the moment, we're just putting out 12 stations over 6 sites across the island. I'll get into the sites at the moment. I'll also talk about the stations as well as the terrestrial and aquatic metrics that we're doing. And we're also putting out trail cameras. So that's, I'll talk about that as well. And we are also getting volunteers from our membership base and communities to help us with this as well. So we've got two sites per geographical region. Bay St. George, I believe they're both in just east of the Codroy Valley area. In the Bay of Islands, they're on the south side of the bay, on the Corner Brook side. And in central Newfoundland, I believe they're both down by Conn River, which isn't technically part of our band, but St. Albans falls just inside of our territory. And so we got a couple of volunteers to put out some stations out there. So our terrestrial metrics are temperature, relative humidity, soil moisture, rainfall, wind speed, direction, and photo period. Yeah, there's not a whole lot to say there. We've got like big old climate stations that sit out and gather all of our information, and they log it onto an SD card. And we have one real fancy 4G connected one that is streaming it straight to my office that we're going to put a real-time feed on the internet. So hopefully we can expand the project to include more of those, but they cost like a couple $100 a year just for the 4G connectivity. Aquatic, we have water temperature, light levels, pH, conductivity, and water levels. I'm still not certain how the water level one works because I haven't been the guy to put together the actual climate stations, but that one, I'm interested to see what comes out of that. And the rest of them is all similar stuff to like a YSI would take. Trail cameras, we're going to be capturing phenology, essentially, berries budding, of trees losing their leaves in the fall. We're also looking at snowfall, snowfall amounts and melt timing. We've got 10 volunteers. They're not really doing any science. They're just kind of accepting the responsibility of our climate stations. But we're just doing the analysis. So they've taken this upon themselves to make sure that it doesn't get beat up or stolen or anything. And if there are some volunteers outside of the selected areas, we're going to give them a trail cam for the phenology. So we're going to continue our risk assessments, and we're going to continue monitoring. We're hoping to add more stations, and we're really trying to tidy up the risk assessment at the moment. But we are looking forward to increasing scope and refining our methods. And our final goals, complete the risk assessments for all of our communities, develop action plans for those communities, and maybe dig a little deeper on some of our metrics for the action plans and stuff. And yeah, that's about it. Use our climate measurements to make our own projections and make things a little more local. That's it.
Are we on here? Oh, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for Ian and the detailed overview of the great work your department's undertaking. I'm just going to shift this camera so that our people on the good move, so that our people on, there we go, can see everybody participating in the panel. So now we have an opportunity to ask direct questions to Ian, or if you have questions later on that you think would be more appropriate to the panel, Ian can take a few questions now. I will hand you the mic that way. Jessica and Amy can hear your questions as well, and everyone watching online too.
Does this one work?
I do believe you might just have to flick on the on switch there.
Testing?
There you go.
Okay, cool.
Hi, Ian. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm the town clerk with the town of Loch Harbour, which was one of your study towns.
It was, yeah.
And actually this is the first I'm hearing that you've actually done this. Are you going to liaise with the community as a whole, and the community council in particular with regards to these results?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Once we get our methods refined a little bit further, because this was just like our initial foray into climate research. So we dealt mostly with the ward councillors for the area when we were choosing towns and talking about what areas should be studied and what areas maybe don't need to be studied. But yeah, moving forward, absolutely going to be working a little bit more closely with the actual towns that we select and study.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Mary McDonald, WWF. Okay. Just quickly on the community self-sufficiency, you had essential and non-essential. And I noticed schools was in non-essential, and that made me wonder who determined the list of what was essential and non-essential?
I asked the same question. Those were outlined on the Newfoundland government website. And I too agree that schools are an essential service, but those lists weren't comprehensive, but no, the schools were not on the list of essential services. So I guess they're boiled down for survivability more so than anything else.
The community wasn't consulted, in other words.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay. It was something already. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, we got a couple more minutes. Would anyone else like to ask a question of Ian and the work being done at Halapu? Please, one second. Head over to Miss Megan Stuckless.
Is the work that you're doing, I guess, as within communities, is that part of broader climate change vulnerability adaptation work being done within those communities, or is there and I guess an opportunity, do you feel, to share that, to create some more of those broad-based sort of planning tools that are, I guess, currently needed in most communities?
Certainly, yeah, but we haven't collaborated with communities on
Right.
what individual communities are doing themselves yet.
Sure, yeah.
This was just, it's a shot in the dark kind of deal. Yep.
No, it's fantastic work. It's interesting.
Thank you.
Hey, we have time for about one more question. Would anyone like to ask a question of Ian?
Oh.
My question's a little bit self-centered, but I'm doing my master's in boreal ecosystems and agriculture at Grenfell. My research is largely math-based. I did my undergrad in math, so I'm looking at sort of statistics and machine learning and stuff like that. Are you guys open to partners on the millions of data points that you have and analyzing them?
Always. Cool. Always, yeah. We more often than not bite off a lot more than we can chew, and then in the end, it's just a scramble to get through all of the data and parse it out. And it comes up quite often that maybe we should talk to somebody at Grenfell and give us a little hand. And then the next thing you know, we're writing our report and it's finished. So. So definitely reach out to us for sure. Which is something I mentioned to Nick this morning. I forgot to include like a credits and a contact info slide, and I'm fresh out of business cards too. So if anybody wants my email or anything like that, I'm actually on the Halabu website as the GIS technicians. That's an easy way to find me. And I'm giving it my Twitter handle, but it's kind of like my personal Twitter handle. So I don't know if I want that associated with my professional life.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much for your presentation, Ian. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's been an honor.
So not only are we demonstrating leadership, we are actively building partnerships here, live action. So I'm just going to switch us over to sharing. Oh, there's Jessica. So Amy Hudson from Nunatuavut is going to be our next speaker to take us through some of the great work being led by the Nunatuavut Community Council in Labrador. So Amy, I just need to, you are receiving a presentation. Good. Okay, Amy, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. Ooh. We hear you perfectly.
we also work with a number of colleagues, including Nick Mercer, on renewable energy initiatives in our community. Especially, and I won't go into data dissemination, Nick, because I understand that you're going to be doing that yourself for the conference. So what we did was we brought some of the folks from the Community Sustainability Initiative all together with various experts in alternative energy, tidal, wind, and solar, and other partners and stakeholders within federal governments and what have you. And we got together and we talked about the work that communities were leading in the area of sustainability, and we decided and talked about renewable energy research, and communities were interested in pursuing this research. And so really, long story short, we worked with those 3 pilot communities, the initial sustainability pilot communities, Black Tickle, Norway, and St. Louis, to carry out the renewable energy research. Was ultimately about gauging the social acceptance of alternative energy technologies in their communities and doing some community baseline community energy planning with those particular communities. And then when we came back to hold a second renewable energy summit with those same people and some new faces and some industry members and what have you, it was apparent that this research was really, really necessary, and people were really interested, and we were asked to expand this research across a vast part of our territory. So then we extended it from Cartwright to Lodge Bay, and I think Nick is going to speak to that research as well. So that research has really been fundamental, and the approach within this research is really grounded in, coming from the interim goals and priorities of communities, and that's why this research has worked so well. And ample opportunity for knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, and there were opportunities for community employment and capacity building throughout all of these pieces as well. And then from that, we realized, okay, we're working a lot within our communities. We're hearing a lot of great voices and so much knowledge and expertise, but a key component we're missing is that of the youth. So during one of our summits, one of our team members came up with this, what we thought was a super cool acronym. I cannot take the credit for it at all. NATURE, which stands for Nunatucket Action Team to Understand Renewable Energy. And so then we work with partners, our own research partners, and CCNL, and Nick and others to support the development of this youth council. From youth from across our territory got together, and the point of this youth council was to build, to understand from youth perspectives, first of all, what's important to them in their communities and how they would like to be involved, and to build capacity and research skills in the area of sustainability and renewable energy technologies. So we just finished phase with the youth in that at the end of June. And so our next thing, we're going to be, the youth and NCC will be co-leading evaluative research to understand where we go from here, from that perspective. And then environment and natural resources. My colleague is in the room. He's the manager of that department. They've also been leading some really key innovative initiatives on the ground in communities to assess and better understand what climate change exists amongst community members, and to better understand some of the traditional and ecological knowledge that is a part of these concerns, and how we can work with our communities and the experts in our communities to better respond to climate change. And some of the early climate change concerns that were identified through this work was in the area of food security as well, rising sea levels, coastal erosion, impact of archaeological sites, which is significant and very important to us in coastal marine areas where erosion and sea level risings are quickly denigrating our heritage sites, and climate change as it impacts our way of life. And so they do a lot more than that, but George can speak to you on that. So this is just sort of an example of some of the initiatives we're involved in, how we're involved in them, and the approach that we take. And for the future, we're really interested now. We're Environment and Natural Resources in my department will convene an internal committee to talk about what are some of the key emerging significant climate change research initiatives that we need to start pursuing together right away, and gaining more youth perspectives, of course, and developing good, meaningful partnerships with various realms of academia, government, and so forth to continue to pursue this work. Nick, I'm sorry, I have no idea where I am with time. I have multiple things, electronics going on.
You're only 1 minute over, Amy, which is not bad.
Oh, that's not bad. Okay, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Amy. All right, Amy, so we do have a few minutes left for members of the audience to ask you some questions. We also have George and Charlene on hand too, who people are going to be able to ask questions throughout the conference. So I'll open the floor up. Would anyone like to ask Amy about any of the ongoing research, climate change research happening at Nunavut? Any takers?
Ask a question about something a little bit more broad.
Yeah, I'm going to start right here just because Megan's closest to my microphone, and then I'll bring it back to that corner after. One sec, Amy. This is Megan Stuckless from CCNL, who funded some of our work.
Hi, Amy. It's nice to actually see you. I think we've chatted by email, but I have, working with young people and environmental issues for a little while now. I've noticed that Indigenous communities, Nunavut and other Indigenous communities in the province really are leading the way in terms of incorporating youth perspective and incorporating youth actively in the process of dealing with and adapting to and mitigating climate change. What would be your, I guess, perspective on why that's important, and how do we communicate that sort of throughout the province and the country? Because sometimes I see a bit of a hole there in understanding of the need for that, that I'm not seeing in Indigenous communities and communities like your own.
Nice to see you too. Quite practically, it's a gap that we've been experiencing for a long time as well. A gap in understanding youth perspectives and having youth at the table to engage really important conversations, right? So actually one of the things that NCC has been doing and going on now simultaneously is hosting its first civic youth engagement initiative. And the goal of that is to begin engaging youth in these types of conversations from governance perspectives that lend to their involvement in everything, right? From climate change to health to whatever is going on. Obviously, the obvious is that what happens after we're too old to do this work, and we are requiring a new generations of people to take on this type of work. It's kind of challenging to do that if we're not now supporting and incorporating, integrating youth leadership and ideas and how we do things, and it's alien as well to just how we actually live in our communities and the way that all facets of community is required for the sustenance of community life. So it's vital when you think about it, about educating, new generations and engaging them also in ways that are relevant and meaningful to them, because as new generations of youth come up, and the world is changing around us, we also have to adapt ourselves to understanding new ways to engage people and new ways and finding new ways to recruit and retain people as things change and as organizations change, as politics changes, as bureaucracy changes, and all of those things, So it's really important that we just have youth on board from the beginning. It's the only thing that makes sense to us.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy, for your fantastic presentation and your thoughtful answers. We did have one more question, but I just spoke to the member of the audience, and we're going to put a pin in it until the panel discussion because we're running a little bit over time. But to both Ian and Amy, I would like to thank you so much for profiling and celebrating the tremendous work that your governments are leading. I think it was a great benefit for everyone here in the room today. I'll also point out we invited speakers from other Indigenous rights holders in the province. Once upon a time, we had speakers lined up from Miapukek as well as Nunavut, but due to some last-minute scheduling conflicts, we kind of had to change the composition of the panel. But thank you very much for representing the work of you and your departments. So now the nature of the panel is going to switch a little bit. Instead of hearing directly from rights holders, we're going to speak from researchers who are engaging in environmental research with and for Indigenous communities to give us an understanding of how we can go about doing climate change research in the most respectful way possible. So without any further ado, I will hand the floor over to Dr. Max Libron. Thank you. Yeah. So, Max, this is yours here. I don't know why I can't see here. I wish. Isn't there a magic button that does? Yeah. Okay.
Screen sharing so that those online can see that as well.
Good thing you're here.
Just a
I have
second.
no idea what I'm doing.
That's all right.
I should have asked you to help me with slides.
There we go.
All right, thank you. All right, can you hear me? All right. Tanche, Mac Liberon de Chinekashun, Laklabish du Chien, Nikia, Métis Nation. My name is Dr. Max Liberon. I'm from Treaty 6 territory in Laklabish, just south of the tar sands, if that helps you place it, in what's lately called Alberta. I'm Mitchif from Métis Nation. I'm the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Research, but today my hat is on as an assistant professor in geography and as a researcher. And specifically as a researcher that works with Nunatsiavut government. So when their representative couldn't come down, they asked that I step in, and when they ask me to do something, I do it. That is our specific relationship. And so here I am. So I'm gonna start a little bit by talking about what Indigenous-led research might look like and how that might be different than other forms of research, and then a little bit about some of the research Nunatsiavut is doing, very little bit. One of my elders and one of my mentors, Rick Chavoy, and I always joked about holding a conference called Against Leadership, which has never been held, but maybe one day. And that's because there's many different forms of leadership, but the way it's usually talked about is only one way. And that is as a hyper-individualized, usually very masculinist, macho sort of leading the way with your genius brain and your autonomy and paving the way for others behind you, that sort of stuff. It's not characterized by humility or community or that sort of stuff. And there are many, many, many different ways to do Indigenous-led research, more diverse than the groups that exist, because there's diversity within groups as well. But the way that I've been taught and the way that I've been working with Nunatsiavut is in much more of what you might call a facilitator role. So instead of a leader, I'm a facilitator, which means I grease the wheels of other people's vehicles, sometimes literally. I try and make platforms for other people's knowledge. I try and bring things together, and I do not try and put my own business first. And so that's why, for instance, this picture doesn't have me in it, and I didn't take it. This is a photo that was taken on Tuesday in Happy Valley Goose Bay. It's the youth from the Labrador Lands and Water Science Camp, which are Inuit and Innu from around Labrador that go there for a bunch of different science lessons. And this particular one was run by Natasha Healy, who's a NCC, Nunavut Community Council beneficiary who works for my lab. And I sent her because this is her territory. I didn't have to go. She's very capable. And she's much closer in age. She's 19. She also runs my lab. I'll talk about that more in a minute. This is her area, and so she's the one who led the research. And what's important there is that these are young researchers. These aren't, people who needed us in particular, but we're there to facilitate the knowledge they already have on the paths they're already on. So what they're doing in this picture is that they're skimming these devices on the surface of the water and looking for plastics, marine microplastics, which you've probably heard about in the news. Plastics are related to decarbonization and oil and gas because they're part of the same pipeline, of course. So if you solve a lot of climate change problems, you usually also solve plastic problems, which is very handy. Except that right now, a lot of oil and gas is dealing with the climate change gap from the switch to renewables by doubling down in plastics, right? So that's such a huge problem. So when I work with Nunatsiavut, we work on a bunch of different things in tandem, which I know most groups and different people do, but we don't separate them out as this one's climate, this one's plastics. It's all sort of ecosystem health, human health, Inuit health, and I'll talk about that more in a second. So that's really important. We're specifically an anti-colonial lab, a feminist and anti-colonial lab. There's many different definitions and types of colonialism. There's settler colonialism, extractive colonialism, internal colonialism. But what they have in common is the assumed settler and colonial access to indigenous lands for settler and colonial goals. And those goals sometimes are benevolent, right? Like wanting to teach people, like at a youth camp, or wanting to do beach cleanups or that sort of stuff, but they still assume access to land. And so that's something our lab tries to be very careful about. So we only go where invited. We stop going when we stop being invited. There's other protocols too that I can talk about, but one of them is that I hire, we're working on samples, if we get invited to a place and we're working on samples from a place, we then hire people from that place to process samples because samples are land, right? So when we get samples from Nunatsiavut, we have Nunatsiavut beneficiaries working on them. So this is part of what's sometimes called scientific sovereignty. Sovereignty is part of what makes Indigenous groups and working with Indigenous groups different than working with other quote unquote diversity groups, because like you say, they're rights holders, not just stakeholders. And sovereignty is one way to talk about that. Also self-determination. There's a cluster of different overlapping but different terms to talk about that relationship. And that needs to also happen in research, like Amy Hudson was saying. So this is just one example. This is, again, Natasha Healy at the science camp on Tuesday. She's the one with the orange hair. I think correctly you're supposed to say red hair, but it's totally orange. She's easy to find in a crowd. So she's up there talking about plastics, talking about her work, and then facilitating other people doing work on plastics and learning about plastics. So yeah, so this is part, and so the thing on the bottom about capacity building, when you say capacity building, it implies that there's a deficit that you need to fill. I have never walked into a community that has a deficit in capacity, generally, right? So if I go to Nunatsiavut, I am very likely to be killed if my friend Liz and collaborator Liz isn't there to help me basically not die at any moment. So I come from a very different north. So there's a lot of capacity there. I have different capacities. Our capacities overlap and we share them. And that looks more like reciprocity and less like me filling up a deficit or them filling up my deficit, for example. It goes back and forth. Yep, and that's part of what Natasha is doing. This is me and Liz. Liz Pioji is one of my main collaborator in Nunatsiavut. She's the Northern Contaminants Researcher. She's one of many scientists employed by the government and also in the community members. Lots of community members are also what you would call scientists, what we would call scientists. And my job is to make it so that Liz doesn't need me anymore. It's to make myself obsolete to the process, and that's very important. And Liz, whenever I say that, Liz is always like, no, I want to keep working with you. I'm like, yes, you want to keep working with me, but you do not need to keep working with me. And that way, if something goes sideways, you can tell me to stop showing up. And that happens. So this is my job, is to make myself obsolete as a facilitator, as opposed to, say, a leader. My work is one very small part of one of very, very many projects that Nunatsiavut is working on called a map of it. A map of it is kind of like a marine protected area, except that what counts as protection includes human interaction, traditional human interaction, and other forms of human interaction, because humans are part of land. So it's a very sophisticated, high-level coordination of many, maybe close to, well, I actually don't know what the numbers are, but many, many, many tens of scientists from around the world, but mostly in the province and in Canada, working to sort of do different scientific, traditional knowledge and other ways of knowing projects around basically the coastline of the land claim areas in Nunatsiavut. Plastics is part of it, but so too is just like how fish move around, what they get up to on an average day, whether they're happy fish, doing fish things, how you would measure that. Climate change is obviously part of it. Plastics is part of it. Contaminants is part of it. Methylmercury is part of it, right? There's all this stuff that's put together as one set of projects. And the last thing I want to touch on, this isn't supposed to be fundamentally legible to you, nor should it be. This is just sort of a look at values and beliefs on one side and epistemologies, or what might be called epistemologies, on the other. And just to show you the intense complexity of the values and things that undergird this work. It's why Indigenous research looks very different than other research, even if it's on the same topic, because we're beholden to these things first. Now, I'm not Inuit, I'm Michif, and there's some overlap, but even where there is overlap, the expression of these values are very different in different places, right? And so that's why I have to be a facilitator. Even though I'm Indigenous, I still have to do a facilitator role. I can't switch into a leadership role. And that would also be true if I was working on my own homelands, right? If I was in, what we call the beaver belt, which is where sort of Michif folks come from, where there's beaver. There we are. So, which is why if you look at the maps, it's like, anyway. So there's always back and forth too, because there's always a lot of heterogeneity within these communities, even across and within Inuit communities. So this is one of the challenges and necessities of, say, Indigenous facilitated research. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Liberal, and for kind of showing everyone in the room how we can go about approaching some of this research, certainly when we're invited. We have lots of time left over, of course, so I will hand the floor over to questions from the audience, but once again, I'll ask you to speak from the mic so that the people listening online can participate too. Any questions for Dr. Liberal?
Is this available online? Can we? Guiding principles and values and beliefs.
So the epistemology text is online. It comes out of a larger report. It's very Googleable, Inuit Values and Epistemology. It'll be one of the first 2 hits. This one, on the values one, I think it's available online. That's not where I got it from, which maybe you can tell from the photo, which is all crumpled. But if you need to find it and you have Inuit collaborators, I'm sure they can help surface it for you.
All right, we got some room for some more questions. Can I take another question for Max?
Hi, so was wondering about the researchers from the communities that help with the project. So they don't necessarily need to go to university, right? That you can fully just train them and, like you said, just make yourself obsolete to them then?
Yeah, there are already a lot of researchers in community. So in the case of Nunatsiavut, they're each of the 5 villages and a couple of other regions have what are called community coordinators, or what are currently called community coordinators. Their name shifts, but they're the ones who are sort of doing all the basic research and data collection and stuff for the different Imapavut regions. And so my job is to train them and also to hope an open training, so anyone, including children, can come, and a lot of youth do come, and elders and everybody in between. So yeah, the goal is that after a while, they don't need me. They've consistently said, we still want you. But one day I'll also retire, and that sort of stuff. But yeah, so they have a lot of researchers. They already have a lot of researchers, and they already do, just like every other group in the province, a ton of their own research, right? So the perfect scenario is that the choice to reach out to academia is always a choice, as opposed to a necessity. Yeah.
All right, we certainly have time for a couple more questions if anyone would like to ask anything of Max. Max, how can you retire when research is a lifelong relationship?
By being hit by a bus. A low carbon bus.
Fair. Yeah, certainly.
So I'm not Canadian. I'm not connected with any. I'm Mexican, so I don't know what my connection is with the land. Actually, kind of got lost in the history. But what would you say to someone like me who's a bit intimidating about working with Indigenous communities?
I would say, and the answer will be very different depending on who you ask for, because again, there's a diversity of opinions on this, is that you shouldn't, I didn't start, and I wouldn't start relationships with, I want to work with you, like your desire, right? Because again, that sort of fits into a colonial frame, which people come to from all sorts of backgrounds, because it's also the academic way, like you lead with your desires. So I tend to start with just showing up to public community events. I have friends in Nunatsiavut, which is how I went there first. I went around with my friend Catherine. She introduced me around. People decided I wasn't an asshole. They decided to keep working with me, right? So that's part of it, is just showing up without your own intentions at the center of it, showing up to see what other intentions are already there, in humility and in respect. And if you can demonstrate that, there's a much greater likelihood of uptaking types of partnership that have to do with your employment, which is probably research in this room. But I think most people will want you to exist as a human with good relations before you exist as a researcher with good relations. That's my opinion anyway, and that's how I was taught. So that's what I would recommend. Lead with your human and follow up with your job. And I think you should actually live life that way too, but that's another question.
And we have time for about one more question. If anyone would like to ask a question to Max, finish this off. All right, well, perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
I have to literally run at 12:30, so apologies if I have to do that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Max.
Thank you.
All right, 1 second there, Jessica, I'm gonna get you set up. See if I can do this right this time. Jessica, the floor is yours. I'll point that camera at myself when we're running out of time, okay? Oh, we hear you perfect. Thank you.
My experiences as an early career researcher and someone that's working and trying to work within my own community. So maybe uniquely at this conference that you're focusing on environment and energy and things like that, my background's actually in health policy and in medical sociology, and my academic work to this point has focused on the social and health impacts of the Muskrat Falls project. So I hope that that can kind of be complementary to some of the other speakers on the panel and also throughout the conference and your discussions over the next couple of days. So one thing that I think we hear a lot about lately is in doing research, and that we've been talking about through this panel, is doing research to meet community needs or responding to community needs. And what does this look like in practice can sometimes be a big question. And I want to make sure that I stress that what I talk about shouldn't be seen as guidelines or best practice, because everyone's research path is different. It's shaped by your personal background, education, the institutions that we work within. But I kind of want what I speak about to be just one example of how I try to do my work in the best way possible within the scope of my projects and the limitations put upon me by the institutions that I work with and in. So my own entry into the research field was kind of an accident, which I think is maybe how it usually goes, but I'm not so sure. In university, I found that studying sociology really helped me understand the social issues that I saw around me growing up in the North. It kind of put all the dots together. So, and I was based in the UK. I've been there for about 6 years now. And that helped me to consider the social issues that I was learning about and experiencing to their global context within these bigger structures of colonialism and capitalism. So when it came time for me to do my dissertation for my master's in global health, I was a little bit stumped. The research paths that I saw around me within academia didn't really motivate me. But instead, I looked around and I thought about what kind of conversations I was seeing happening in my community. What were people talking about? What are people asking questions about, worrying about? What do people want to know? So around this time, there was a lot of talk in Labrador about the Muskrat Falls project and the health concerns around methylmercury contamination of food sources for Indigenous peoples. So I asked myself, how could the skills that I gained at university, the privileges that I gained through university, contribute to the conversation in some way, because this is an issue that affects my family. And that led to me doing my master's work with the Labrador Land Protectors in Goose Bay about their health concerns around the Muskrat Falls project. So I ended up doing interviews and a sharing circle and surveys with land protectors, most of whom were Indigenous, in summer 2018. And if you're interested in reading more about that, there's a summary report of results that are on my website. And during that project, several of my participants asked me to continue working on the issue. So they told me that I should speak to people on the coast about their views as well, because those people would be affected as well. So that kind of spiraled into a PhD that I didn't initially intend on doing, but I kind of fell into research that's broadly in the environmental field, because that's where my skills were needed at the time. And I think that's really key to doing research with Indigenous communities and doing meaningful research. It should be rooted in the community's questions and desires, because Indigenous communities already have our own research questions. It's not really necessary to kind of create questions and go to the community. Communities already know what they want to know. So it's more trying to use, I try to approach it by using the skills that I have to help answer some of those questions. So one of the only ways that I've been able to do the work that I can in a way that I hope is respectful of communities is because I can root my work in the methodological underpinnings established by other Indigenous researchers. In particular, people like Sean Wilson, Linda Tuiwai Smith, and Robin Wall-Kimmerer are big influences to me. So historically, researching Inuit communities has not been beneficial to communities themselves. It's benefited researchers who are looking to further their career with data that's extracted from Inuit. So in my work, instead, I tried to center relationality, reciprocity, and accountability. And they're key values for me because they're key to working in Inuit communities. If you've ever been to an Inuit community, people want to know who you are. They want to know who your parents are, in my case, my grandparents. And it helps place us and place our intentions and why we're there. And it keeps us accountable when people know your aunties and your grandparents. So a key part of implementing these principles in practice for me is reflexivity. And I'm part of the community that I work in. I'm deeply invested in my work when the implications affect my family and my friends. But I also grew up in a different community, and in a way, I'm kind of coming back. So for me, this means constantly interrogating myself, because regardless of if you're a social scientist or a natural scientist, academic work isn't objective, and our positionalities always play into how we do our work throughout the whole process. So recognizing relationality and being reflexive are important regardless of where you're from, regardless of if you're working in your home community or not, because relationships exist. Regardless of how small they are at the beginning, you're still accountable and in relation with people that you work with. So a kind of more recent example since I've started my PhD is, and it's way too early to talk about results or anything like that, but part of my reflexive practice for my PhD is integrating communication and consultation in my work from the very beginning. And just because I'm from the community, that doesn't mean that I know best and that I should determine what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. I've grown up away and I'm coming back in a different context and a different purpose than just, a family visit. But because of this, I spent nearly 2 months this spring visiting Labrador without any concrete plans. I kind of just hung out and met with people, listened to their thoughts. Sometimes I spent the day boating with my uncle, and sometimes I had formal meetings. And I think both of these were equally beneficial to not only my work, but the kind of broader way that I see my positionality within the community. And so I had a basic idea when I went in building on my master's work, like I'd been asked, but I was also trying to get different people's perspectives and listening to what people believed were information gaps that my work could fill. So this time I found was really crucial to relationship building, and it allowed me to take time to understand the community organizations and existing research infrastructure that already is there that I'll be working in, because a lot of really hard work has gone into building research infrastructure, like we've seen through the previous presentations, and so it's learning how to work within that is really important, I think. So I do recommend spending time in communities, building relationships before the bulk of work actually starts. And I know that that doesn't fit into the typical academic model, especially with increasing time and funding pressures. But they're kind of the changes that we need to make if we're going to create meaningful research relationships. And the typical research model has historically been extractive and oppressive. And so in order to kind of turn that on its head, I think it's important to take any leeway that we have to make changes in that way. So other ways that I'm trying to integrate Indigenous research methodologies is by using culturally responsive methods, such as youth workshops and elder-specific events, and by integrating sealskin crafting into my work. So those are things as well that, like Amy was talking about, the importance of youth involvement in research. Inuit culture is, in Nunatsiavut, it's very focused on intergenerational relationships and elders teaching youth, and youth have important voices in our communities. So trying to make sure that we value voices from all across the spectrum of life experiences. So kind of coming to a little conclusion, Robin Walthamore writes in Braiding Sweetgrass that, quote, "We spill over into the world and the world spills over into us," end quote. And this is something that I try to keep in mind when I'm doing my research. None of us can dissociate ourselves from our work, and everything is tangled. So instead, I kind of see reflexivity as teasing apart some of those knots and considering them and sitting with the discomfort and trying to work through all of these knots throughout the research process. And I think key to everything that I've spoken about is listening to communities about what they want research, listening to how's the best way to do that research, listening to future directions for research, and listening to the structures that communities already have in place and working within those. And now I kind of wanted to end, because I've been talking about reciprocity, is I had some questions for you guys. So just things that you can think about, we can talk about, or you can think about throughout the conference, talk about with your fellow participants, or just think about personally is, and I think they're applicable regardless of if you're in academia or the public sector, private sector, or in the charitable sector. And I would like you to think about if your work meets a community determined need, if you're working with communities who determined the work that you're doing. And are you being reflexive about your positionality in the work that you do with communities? And finally, how are you listening to communities throughout your work? From the beginning, before things start, from the beginning to the end, and even after the end of your projects. So I hope that some of what I've talked about has been useful or thought-provoking in some way. And I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. Nakami.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jessica. Well, we have lots of time for Q&A, so I'll open the floor. Would anyone like to ask a question of Jessica? And once again, I'll give you the mic to make sure everyone listening at home can tag along as well. Yeah, Jessica, the room is really interested if you could repeat the 3 questions that you'd like us to consider throughout our work here.
So the first one is, does your work meet a community-determined need? And the second one is, are you being reflexive about your positionality throughout your work? And finally, how are you listening to communities throughout your work from beginning to end and beyond?
Everyone is writing frantically.
I can post them on Twitter too, if that's helpful.
That'd be very helpful. Would anyone else like to ask a question of Jessica? Still typing, still tweeting. Any takers? Any more questions? Max.
Hi, Jessica. It's Max. I don't think you can see me. Hi.
I can see the corner of your face.
I'll move my face. There we go. So can you talk about some of the complexities of doing research on your own land when you didn't grow up there? I think that would be like nearly insurmountable. So can you talk about some of the special relations and obligations that you have?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of obligations that I have because I grew up in Nunavut, so still in Inuit Nunavut, but Inuit regions are incredibly diverse, and I don't think we can generalize the culture or even just the approaches to different things and epistemologies. So that's something that I constantly deal with, and part of my reflexivity and looking into my positionality is looking at my space within the community, and that's kind of why I spent this spring just hanging out in Labrador, is because I have all these ideas about Labrador because I visited as a kid and my family's from there, and I thought it was really important to actually go back and see, you know, in this context, what are my relationships to people and what is it like now that I'm here as an adult doing research. And I found that people have been so welcoming and so nice, and everyone says welcome home, even though I didn't grow up there. But still, I am very wary of asserting any of my kind of values or perspectives in my work. So that's where I've really tried to be very open. And I went in with a basic idea because I think that it's important not to burden communities with your research and telling them that they have to decide what you do. But I think that also is really open to just, you know, making changes as needed, and that did come about. So I just try to stay open in all of the work we do so far.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jessica. And we have time for about one more question specifically for Jessica before we break into a panel. Take any more questions for Jess? No, one more, Jess, coming.
How do you balance the needs from an Indigenous standpoint that you were just talking about to maybe the very constrained straitjacket that academia puts on you? Is that a difficult balance to strike?
Yeah, it is a difficult balance. In itself, but there are certain academic expectations that sometimes don't mesh with my obligations to my community, and I still, you know, I'm wary of discarding the academic. I mean, I'm doing a PhD, so I do need to be mindful of my academic obligations, but my community comes first to me. I kind of just do what I want. My supervisors are great and they're really flexible, and I mostly just do what I want, and it's worked out so far. I never went into academia with any kind of expectations about what that would look like, because it was all kind of an accident and just spiraled into a PhD. But yeah, the worst thing that can happen, I tell myself, is that I can put my PhD and I get a job in my community, and to me that would be more valuable than doing a PhD that I don't think is actually beneficial in some way. So I try to prioritize my community's needs above academia, which isn't integral to my life really. So right now it works for me, but if it stops working, it stops working, and I'm okay with letting that go.
Okay. Oh, we're coming. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Jessica, for showing us how you go about doing research with and for your community. Okay, so I do understand that Max needs to leave us in about a minute. Oh, we just found someone else to take the dogs out, so Max will be sticking around. So with that, I'll ask our in-person panelists, Max and Ian, perhaps to join us at the front of the room if you're comfortable. And I will work on bringing Amy and Jess back up on our TV. Just stick with me for a moment. Good man. Can I borrow it after? Where's Amy? Amy, do you have your screen sharing on?
Sorry, no, I don't have screen sharing on. What do you want me to do?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
One sec, we got the expert. Okay, perfect. Well, Thank you very much for your incredible contributions to our panelists. It's really great to see the great research which is being led by rights holders in Newfoundland and Labrador. And it's really beneficial for everyone at the conference to see how researchers going about engaging with this research. If anyone knows me, I have a very big mouth. And I find it very difficult not to question and say things throughout the presentation. So I've had this one bottled up, and I'd like to lobby it to you folks to start us off. Junior researchers have a really difficult time implementing these principles. We're sent to grad school. We have a very short amount of time, maybe a year, to accomplish research projects. And what I always like to say, it's really difficult to spend a year drinking tea. It's really difficult to spend a year hanging out in Labrador when you need to pay an extra semester of tuition if you're not done. So the question I always like to ask experts in this space is, how can junior researchers who are just starting out go about participating in this research as respectfully as possible, given the constraints that academia puts on us? And maybe I'll start with our remote presenters and then move into in-room, and then we can flip things up afterwards. So Amy or Jess, did you have any particular thoughts there?
I guess I can start. I am also a junior researcher dealing with these questions right now and always. And I think I said near the beginning of my presentation just to like work within the scope of what we can do. We're not all on, I'm the only researcher on my project. It's not like a big thing with a PI and a bunch of different researchers. It's just me. So I can only do what's in the limitations of my own capabilities. So I think just keeping that in mind and being mindful of what you can do within the space that you're given. And I think that is generally sufficient if you're being genuine and interacting with communities in a respectful way. They'll be responsive to that.
Thank you, Jess. And Amy, did you have any particular thoughts? I know you've taught me lots of things.
I think I have to speak from my experience, and I think my experience so far is that senior researchers, people who have been embedded within the academy for a long time, can sometimes be the bigger challenge. And junior researchers, I don't know who qualifies as like junior researcher, or if I do or what, but I think that people just sort of starting out in research are usually come with the expectation that they are going to learn with their partner and in collaboration. So, for example, Nick, you and then some others that we work with in their master's work and what have you, has been sort of the easiest, I think, if that makes sense. Yeah, the bigger challenges have been with senior researchers, and certainly those with entrenched within sort of institutionalized ideologies and ways of thinking about how research has been done in the past. Certainly that's not to universalize that statement either. There's lots of really good researchers with decades of experience behind them that has done great work with us.
Thank you, Amy. And I believe Max has some thoughts here in the rooms. I see the microphone locked and loaded.
Yeah, so I work in the research office at the university, and that means a big part of my job is putting out crises that happen, mostly in Indigenous research situations. And the problems that we have, to echo Amy, are almost never with graduate students who are literally our most productive researchers, because all they do is research, right, compared to folks who are employed by the university. That being said, as an advisor, I almost never recommend that my graduate students do community-based research unless they are very willing to do it for a very long time that surpasses all university expected timelines, which most of them can't afford to do. So it's always a trick about balancing feasibility with respectful methodologies, and not just methodologies, if a lot of my students are also Indigenous, and so also their own obligations, which can sometimes be even trickier to navigate and longer to navigate. So usually we have a big chat about that, and so far no one has chosen to not do community work. I have 2 PhDs who are like, yes, community work, against some of my advice, but that's because that's why they're there, right? So it's super tricky, and so it's the advisor's job to put as much work into making sure the resources are there in training, in money, in time, in not having to do TAs so that they can go out, right? That sort of stuff, and not have time bound having to be on campus, as well as blocking certain committees from trying to take away money because now they have too much, right? And all this sort of stuff, that it becomes an advisor's very unique job if their student is doing community-based research. So it's not just the student who has to think about that, it's also the advisors.
Thank you very much, Max. And Ian, did you have any particular thought on junior researchers?
I don't have a whole lot to add, but having junior researchers and interns and stuff have, to echo what Max and Amy have said, they've always been some of our hardest workers. We're kind of a new band, and we're also still kind of finding our own way with regards to approaching things and the community respectfully. So yeah, at the office, it's we're still kind of trying to figure our own way, you know.
Perfect. Well, selfishly, thank you very much for your input on my question. I was holding the mic so I didn't frantically take notes, but I'm going to ask you all the questions for the rest of the time. So thank you very much. I'll now turn over to the floor. Would anyone like to have a question they'd like an individual speakers or the panel as a whole to address? I got a question here in the back. I'll bring it back.
Hi, thank you all very much. That was wonderful and insightful and great. My name's Leah. I'm a member of the Social Justice Co-op, and we're working on creating some space for the community to come together and talk about what a Green New Deal for Newfoundland and Labrador might look like. So what I'm wondering is, what are your thoughts or ideas for how to center community-driven and Indigenous-led research, as well as local and Indigenous government structures in processes of trying to rein in major public sector, private sector rather, polluters, a lot of which are multinational corporations, and they exist outside of the jurisdiction of our local and even our national government structures. Any ideas about what it could look like for like community to hold private sector accountable?
So do we have, the gist of the question I believe was, given the confines of local governments in Newfoundland and Labrador and want to make sure that we're respecting their autonomy, how can we go about kind of these interjurisdictional issues and reining in things? I guess this is a climate change conference. How can we go about making sure that we're reining in some of these larger interjurisdictional issues so that rights holders, you know, are able to maintain a traditional way of life in their territories?
I don't want to speak to this, but I have something I can say on it. I think it's really important to look to people who are already doing this. I can't say that as a researcher I'm already doing this, but I see Amy in the second row there. And the Labrador Land Protectors have done a really amazing job of trying to hold people accountable. And I think that we can look to activist groups who are doing work on trying to hold big businesses and then corporations, even when they're government associated, to account. I can't say that as a researcher. I try to speak about social justice issues, but I think we need to look to the people on the ground for the most leadership on that.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And I can throw out a question to kind of build on this. And Amy, I'm really interested in your thoughts in particular. Not to throw you under the bus, but I do that often. President Russell was recently at the United Nations, and he talked about climate change as an ongoing form of colonialism that's affecting people in your territory. Do you have any thoughts about that, or how we can interact that, or any guidance for people in the room?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of President Russell. I was with him at the UN, but I won't go there. I'm aware of that conversation. I think, from my perspective, and the research that communities have been leading through Inuit governance research and sustainable community planning, this reflects questions that still center around jurisdiction, being that the autonomous jurisdiction may lie with provincial or federal governments. So from an Inuit governance perspective, or Nunatuhavu Inuit governance perspective, we very much understand, the communities are telling us that we have to be involved and ultimately responsible for making decisions that impact us and our lives. So what that means in practice is that I don't know how, I don't think it's up to the community to decide how an external or private industry or government can ensure they're reflected if they just respect the fact that we are not stakeholders, that we are rights holders who continue to live on our lands, and respect our approach to governance, which would mean that we make decisions that impact us, then it would be more of a collaboration. And so then at that level, I guess, just to give a sort of an example, a provincial governing body couldn't make these blanket decisions about a community or multiple communities in our territory, nor could the federal government or a private industry. I think we see that happening now in the area of alternative energies, where people think they can just come into our territory and into our communities and make these decisions and start doing this work. Well, that's not actually how our community members feel. And so respecting Inuit governance and decision-making is really important. Does that answer a little bit?
Makes perfect sense to me. Okay, well, with that, I'll turn it over to the room once again. Did anyone have any other questions for the panel about Indigenous-led research, climate change, etc.? We got a question from Megan.
I'll echo the thanks. This has been incredibly insightful, informative. It's been really great. Thank you so much to all of you. I guess my question, coming from a nonprofit background, would be, is there, first and foremost, a role for, I guess, nonprofits within the province, within the country, to support the work that you're doing? And if so, what would be your recommendations on the best approach to start opening some of those doors and building some of those collaborations that is respectful and mindful of the sovereignty of Indigenous nations within the province?
Amy, Ian, Max.
Is that Megan? Let's see.
Yeah, Megan at CCNL.
Yeah, well, you're pointing out what?
Megan from CCNL. Yes, Amy.
Okay. Yeah, well, Megan, you're kind of already doing that with us. So that's an example of how to do that. And I mean, partnerships and collaborations are important, right? I wouldn't want romanticized ideas about research sovereignty and what that looks like to distract, in the sense that from our perspective, living in relation with each other, and whether that's other Inuit or non-Inuit or whomever, is an important part of life and how we all function together as a society. So those relationships and collaborations are important, and just the way that you guys support that has led to, and hopefully how we can build upon that in the future. I think that's a good example already, the work you're doing.
Thank you, Amy, and I believe Max in the room.
Yeah, I think so. Nunatsiavut works with a lot of different NGOs and stuff like that, and I think it seems to be a very similar approach, as depending the scale of the researcher, whether it's a small organization or a person, doesn't matter. You still have to go through the ethics review. You still have to start with your relationships. You still have to write all those sorts of things. So they're quite similar in that way. Yeah, and organizations are full of people, so same sort of deal.
I certainly can't speak for anybody else, but we kind of operate similar to an NPO anyway at our office. And I mean, we wouldn't be able to do a whole lot without our relationships with other NGOs or other organizations. I think that we have a little bit of a relationship between Halibu and NCC. We had an intern who is now working in the office next to me, but yeah, we wouldn't be able to get half as much done without our relationship. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. So we are quickly running out of time here. So I think for one more, unless there's any other pressing questions coming from the room, I just wanted to thank our representatives from our rights holders, Ian Sullivan from Halipu First Nation, as well as Amy Hudson from the Nunatsiavut Community Council, as well as representatives from Nunatsiavut and Mi'kmaq in Innu Nation, who unfortunately weren't able to make it, but certainly supported us a great deal in bringing all this together and getting other speakers on board. So I thank you very much for making time and helping us profile and celebrate some of the great research that's being led. To our researchers, I mean, I think your folks' research is exemplary, and it's something that can inspire people in the room to start going about this the right way. So with the little bit of time we have left, I'd just like to ask you folks, if you don't mind, if there's one thing people who participate in this session should take away from this about how to engage in research respectfully with and for Indigenous communities, how to support the great climate change research-oriented work that's already going. What's the one thing that we need to remember from your perspective? And maybe I'll start in the room. Max, does this work for you? One thing we should all remember.
Get behind things that are already happening. They're already good things. Yeah.
We don't need to recreate the wheel. There's already great things going on. Right? Yeah. Right. Hey, Ian?
I think Max said it best earlier when she said, bring your humanity first.
Mm-hmm.
Human first, job second. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian. I'll go up to Jessica on the left corner of our screen. Oh, you're muted, Jessica. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
You're back.
Okay, so yeah, I think similar to Max's point, just like listening to communities and listening to what people want and what's already happening and seeing how you can contribute best to the needs that are already been established.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jessica. And last but certainly not least, my friend Amy. What can you leave us with?
Gosh, this one is funny. I guess ultimately from the vision of a research department within an Inuit governing organization, it's that we do research that seeks to counter a colonial legacy that has had detrimental harm upon our people and communities, and that harm continues today. So just being willing and open to share your skills with us to do research that mitigates and addresses those harms.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, to our panelists, Max, Ian, Jessica, Amy, we thank you so much. And just as a closing word, once again, the intention of this session for us was not to dictate to anybody how they should decarbonize, whether they should decarbonize. The intention was always to celebrate and profile the incredible work that's already being done amongst rights holders groups in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we thank you very much for your time, for showing us what's already going on. So thank you kindly, everyone. Goodbye.
Lunch is at 1?
No, but a lot of people.
If I need to do anything here.
Yeah, and that's perfect.
Oh, hey, oh my God, we've got so many time. Yeah, for sure. Oh, no. I thought we were going to talk. Oh, that's so bad. In fact, not Labrador anymore. No, yeah. I'm So who's here from Dallas? Like programs going to Yes. Yeah, yeah. We'll be on here at electricity probably, right? Yeah. So yeah. So it's kind of like else can present all of the yeah. He's retired, so hopefully he can unleash. Yeah, I'm really interested to hear from natural forces. Yeah, this is like especially on the place, right? Where we're they're the right interest in just like it's just for us to listen. Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna consult our no, that's not how this works. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so nice to finally meet you in person. Yeah. Nice to meet you. We'll see you later. That cell phone belongs to me. Thank you for all your help there with all the things. That's any issues on other ones?
Yeah, it had a similar issue on the other wing side. It was sort of this realization that, because we've got this audio loop going, all the microphones go in, come out of the floor box into the computer for everyone online. But the audio coming back from them didn't join into that loop, so we needed to. It does it in the main room, but evidently we're realizing.
I got you. Well, I know it's managed chaos, but we've got a number of comments from journalists and stuff already that they've never seen logistically and technically a conference so well run. So kudos to you folks so far. You got it. You've set a high bar. This was probably one of the most complicated ones, though, because we had two remote panelists.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of frequent back and forth, right? And it wasn't like every other one where it just bring off a panel.
Yeah. So like each room, the middle room is the most flexible of everything. We can't do everything we need one together different ways. So it's like creative.
Yeah, hold on.
Exactly. That's creativity.
Yeah, so we saw it way anyway.
And a lot of the licenses is not expired.
Yeah, I think the guy last year who made this presentation was talking about like how they were so excited because they just got like a bunch of new oil companies interested in the offshore drilling in Newfoundland. So I guess like as other areas move away from exploratory drilling, anywhere that's still doing it. Yeah.
I think actually are already creating change. Policy makers are like, it's very interesting. I was really interested. I think that's what the field work. It's like, like our way to work right now are both pretty clear. Really hard. So the futures is look like it's so big down. It's totally different.
That's hard here though because of the divided governance.
Yeah.
Like you can do whatever you want as a nation, but if Alberta is still kind of investing in its tar sands and their per capita emissions are not. So like sometimes I wish I work for NP. Have a government like I'm the director of the Ray where this is promoted to say I'll give you the job. That's enough of this. So you can only one decision maker.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting. Yeah, like I was kind of on some of the behind the scenes of the conference, and like when things kind of started falling apart, I was like, I messaged Jessica and I was like, do you want to like Skype it to a conference? And she was like, maybe. It's like. So, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think like the way she uses spoke to things, I thought was like really. I thought it was like really cool and very well said. Yeah. She's very practical minded person. Yeah. I'm very maybe we can create little self-sustaining communities that are in strategic locations that are less likely to be overseen out there. Impacts, but I always want to have like rural reservations because like what gives us the right to do that is because of ants. Yeah, I know they're called like a place like that. You know, it's like on the list. Yeah, it's right. Undermine their safety from climate change. I don't know. Yeah, I think there is like there's other trends and like it does feel like there is that might be wrong. Yeah, that's more like by this river for an hour. Food. Yeah, same. Yeah, my life, I mean, my stomach has been giving me grumpiness. And it's not been down. Oh, yeah. So like this morning, my mom was like, I was like, I need some fruit. And then then she got like, can't drink. So I was like, no, it's too acidic. Like, I can't. Like, no. I really like soft. I was really like weird, but I'm just like, yeah. Chances are, probably no. Where's lunch happening? At the living room. Cool, I'm here covered. And this is session 2. Which one are we doing here? Oh, I haven't even looked. Off-grid electricity, climate adaptation and policy, and urban transportation. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so I supervise NL talks. And one of the reasons he's not gonna be presenting just right. Who's presenting in his place? No one. Oh, sad. But yeah, like it was like maybe a few weeks early, so I like sent an email for him, like, oh, like I need to go, and I was like, yes, leave, like baby. And then yeah, I just got to work her this morning, and she's pretty small, but she's standing she's here. Yeah, the pregnancy was quite complicated, so and Jean let him and his partner like come down, and so that she yeah, they know that most women like.
If you want to start tossing maybe you can pass it.
I think it's
here I'm just this minute thinking I should put my slides up into the computer. So
Do you want to just do it yourself? You're the only one using slides, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, ex-university prof, you're gonna like turn to the tools, you know.
Yeah. Is this the room we're using?
This is it, yeah.
Okay. All right. So if you want to do that, just go ahead.
Great.
And Kirsten Maury asked if she can go first. I guess. Maybe
Sure.
she has to
I don't care.
I said it was fine with me. So,
This
but as you're the
four of us. Four of us.
Four, yeah. Dave Lane, Kristen, and
Ian.
Ian Proud and you. So, but you're the only one with slides, so go ahead and put them up.
Great.
Thanks. Good to see you.
No, don't worry. Is there anything else I need to think about before I start?
What?
Is there anything else I need to do or think about? You're kind of sharing, or?
I'm sharing,
Right,
so
okay.
I'm going to keep people pretty tightly to their 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my main job, I think.
Yeah, always.
And, well, and I guess then sharing the next part, you know, where people
Sure.
respond to it and so on.
How are we going to do the round table-y things with this share setup?
That's a good question. I guess if we can get tape, we could just shove the chairs aside and tape the flip charts up on the walls. Yes. But I will go ask maybe.
Yeah, put them up on the walls with what? We got blue tack. No,
Yeah,
blue
we need
tack's not going to
something
work.
Stick it up. Well, in the room where I was last session, a couple of groups put their flip charts pages on the wall, and it worked better actually to see what was happening. But I don't know what to pick it up with. I will see.
Come on. Mhm. 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 What? Why? Arg. Hi.
Just a handheld. Oh yeah.
Hi.
Hi, apparently we are not in this room, we're in the room on the other side.
Okay.
I was told by Brett.
That's weird. Okay, because it said B. Whatever.
It says A now, I don't know if they switched that or what.
But we're not in the big room. We're in another room.
Yeah, in the room on the other side.
On the other side. Okay. Well,
This
that's
is, yeah, I think the other one is A. But I'll go
All right.
check, but Brett
No.
told me that we're on the other side.
that's fine. I'll because now that I've seen onto the internet.
Oh, okay, so it doesn't matter.
The internet's listening.
Right, okay.
Where are the other? No. Where are the other panels? Are they?
There's here somewhere, still eating, I think.